be true with individual believers. You know, not every kind of person who's even a fundamentalist or even wants to bring America back to these mythical Christian roots, you know, wants to fight a kind of scorched earth culture war. But against the leadership of this movement, they're not interested in plurality. You know, they're not interested in democracy. They might want to use those tools in as much as they can use them to amass power, but ultimately they don't want to kind of give us the same indulgence.
Hopefully this isn't the same question Ray asked. You've obviously thought about this a lot and studied a lot. What can people do? It seems like we're in a soundbite reality, and the people who are defining the discussion are extremists, and the majority out there truly is silent and unorganized, and we're losing.
Right. Well, there's a couple of things. I mean, one of the things I write in this book, and it's kind of a dispiriting thing, but I think that ultimately any real solution has to start with electoral reform, because I said before that this is a movement that constitutes 10 to 15% of the population. So why are they making policy for everyone? You know, part of it has to do with their superior organization, but part of it also has to do with the kind of massive electoral advantage given to conservative Republicans, which has a lot to do with gerrymandering, the creation of all of these safe seats for Republicans, which kind of promotes radicalism by making the primaries the place where elections are really decided. You know, the kind of composition of the Senate, which, you know, the founders intended, but it also means that, you know, people in New York or California are vastly underrepresented compared to people in Wyoming, you know, or Idaho. And the same thing is true with the Electoral College. I mean, I would like to see some of the big states maybe split up so they can get a little more clout. But those are all like really long-term solutions, and they're not going to happen anytime soon. And so that's to say that's what the only thing we can do is a little bit hopeless. I mean, I do think there are, again, I think it's a difficult struggle, especially because this movement is, you know, 30 years in the making, and so we're trying to construct a response quite quickly. There are new organizations forming. I'm on the I recommend an organization in this book, and I've since become a member of the advisory board. So I hope that's not too much of a conflict of interest, but there's an organization called the Campaign to Defend the Constitution that is kind of a move-on style organization that's designed to bring attention to some of these issues, you know, designed to publicize injustices, hold politicians to account. And then there's also a real need for an organization that will get involved in this stuff on the local level. I mean, I would guess that a lot of people sitting here have seen places where this stuff is, because a lot of times these things happen in public schools in ways that, you know, outsiders don't get involved, and, you know, they just happen and they just become a fact of life, and people grit their teeth and deal with it. Now, I'm not saying that you need to bring the ACLU in every time, you know, every time a teacher tries to indoctrinate your kids in school, but what we have right now is that whenever these battles flare up, you have a number of organizations, Christian nationalist organizations, that will come in to instruct members of the school board. You know, they teach people how to run for school board, how to run for town council. You know, we don't really do that anymore. The Democratic Party doesn't really do that anymore. When somebody starts talking about creationism on their school board and it hits the wires, they've got you know, people are calling them up and saying, don't say creationism, say intelligent design. You know, we don't have someone who's kind of instructing the people and giving support to the people who are trying to defend the teaching of evolution. I mean, the ACLU and Americans United and all these other organizations do such good work, but they don't really get involved until it already is going to the courts. And by then, the political issue is often lost, and that's a problem. I mean, people who believe in the separation of church and state and the rights of religious minorities have often depended on the courts to protect them, which is understandable in a lot of ways, but it's also no longer feasible. I mean, the courts themselves are being given over to this movement in a large part. And so there needs to be, I think, a grassroots political strategy. That sounds kind of abstract, but, you know, something to teach people on the ground how to fight these battles politically in their own communities.
Michelle, thank you so much for coming here. My question and my concern of late is every time the word or the statement faith-based is used, it is then hijacked by the Christian group. And if you put yourself in a faith-based position, you're automatically considered Christian by that group. And there's a huge concern there because there's a hijacking and a misuse of language that makes everybody who isn't faith-based a non-Christian, but people are a little reticent to even say they're faith-based sometimes. So can you address that?
Yeah, more than that, some people are even reticent to say that they're Christian, which is, who are. People, it's not just that, believers of all sorts feel that kind of the idea of faith has been hijacked by one sect, by one kind of far-right, or, by a far-right collection of Christian sects. A lot of Christians, feel, that this political ideology says nothing about their faith, doesn't represent them at all. And I've gotten actually really sad emails from people who said, well, I guess I would consider myself a Christian, although these days I'm embarrassed to say that, which is really too bad, that people are being made to feel that way. And so there is, I think, a kind of nascent religious left in an attempt to provide another voice and to say that, God doesn't belong to James Dobson or Pat Robertson. There's, the network of spiritual progressives. There's been a number of different conferences of the religious left. There's Jim Wallace, who's the kind of liberal evangelical, who's organizing people. I mean, ultimately, I don't think that I don't think it's possible or desirable to have a kind of liberal equivalent of the Christian right, because I don't think anybody on the left wants their congregations to be turned into political machines. I mean, that's not why you come here. But there is, I think, an effort to say that the religious voice is not just the voice of the right. And part of I think one of the only ways you can, not one of the only ways, one way you can further that is by calling journalists on it. Journalists are susceptible to it. If you say, if you see an article in which, a right-wing conservative fundamentalist pastor is quoted as the voice of the religious, you need to write a letter, or you need to have, your kind of religious leaders write a letter and, and say you're misrepresenting what it is to be a person of faith.
Hi, I want to thank you for coming. I've really enjoyed your insightful presentation and such. I wanted to ask, you say there's a reality that they're building up, and could you speak to maybe where the other reality that there has failed?
Say that again. The other reality.
Where the other reality has failed, and as
Sure.
a source.
Well, a couple things. I mean, on the one hand, when I was talking before about Obama's speech, liberalism, I think, has stopped giving people answers to their big problems, or even speaking to their big problems. And so, as I was saying out there, I mean, there is a sense of tremendous anxiety in the country, a fear of national decline, a fear of family breakdown. If people fear that pop culture has become really vulgar and materialistic, which of course it has, and so they have this diagnosis, that America was a godly Christian country. Then kind of this myth of separation took over. If the country fell into these unimagined lows throughout the last 100 years, and that gay people kind of marched out of the closet while preachers were driven underground, and so it's this kind of very, very it's a narrative that makes a lot of sense to people. And then along with that comes this revisionist history and this rejection of Enlightenment values. I mean, one thing that they'll often write is that or not often write, but that some of the thinkers will write. And the people behind this movement are often very deep thinkers. They're not just rubes, or snake handlers. They've thought pretty carefully about this. And so their rejection of the Enlightenment is overt, it's not just implied. And they write that all of history is a struggle between the Renaissance and the Reformation, and they're on the side of the Reformation. And so and in many cases the lodestar there is is kind of